Okay, well, good afternoon and a warm welcome, everybody. I'm Janice Goldstroll-White, one of Martin Gill's colleagues at Perpetuity, and I'll be chairing today's session. And today I'm told it's our 161st Thought Leadership webinar. And today's topic is, does the professional thief and organised criminal have a safe haven in committing economic crimes? As many of you already know, we're here every week, usually at this time on a Thursday afternoon, examining a topic of central interest to the prevention of crime. And the idea of our thought leadership webinars is that we critique today in order to get a better type of understanding and prevention for tomorrow. Our intention as of today is not to try and solve all the world's issues in one session. In fact, today we're examining a massive topic. More, we're trying to encourage new thinking and ideas, to debate what's going on and to put forward different perspectives to change current practices. And a copy of this webinar will be put on our website, on our OSPA's website tomorrow, so it can be referred to in the future. In terms of this topic, there's increasing evidence that economic criminals operate under the radar of crime prevention measures and outside the mainstay of the law enforcement activity. In some countries, at least, and this is particularly so in the UK, the majority of this type of crime is fraud and related offences. And offenders tell us when we're interviewing them, certainly in prison, that some types of economic crime are easy to commit, unlikely to be pursued by authorities, and so the chances of avoiding capture are pretty high for them, and moreover it's lucrative for them. So is this situation true? How can we begin to think differently about these offences, and how do we get an appropriate focus? Therefore, the purpose of this webinar is to discuss, why is economic crime so high? What are the gaps in the broad preventative approach so far that need to be plugged? And what factors will trigger an improved response to this? And so today we're going to hear from three experts, all of who have immense experience in tackling fraud, and therefore we look forward to what they're going to tell us about their thoughts on this topic. So without further ado, what I'm going to do in a second is invite our panel to introduce themselves, and once they've done that, I'll ask them to make their opening statement. That's about 3 minutes when they've got to get their say on whatever they want to on this topic. After that, we'll ask you, the audience, to ask questions. So can I encourage you to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screens, and please try and get your questions in early, and we'll endeavour to include as many as we can in the ensuing discussion. So without further delay, let's go and meet our panel. So let's first go to Sandra. Sandra, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sandra Pistone. I'm the Director of Research and Development at CIFAS. Anyone who is not familiar with CIFAS, we are an organisation that supports sort of 650-ish, some of which have been the biggest organisations in the UK, share the details of fraudulent conduct that they've experienced in order to prevent those same individuals, entities, phone numbers, email addresses, etc., being used again to perpetrate more fraud. I've been working in fraud prevention for 20+ years now, in a range of roles. Most recently, I'm looking at what the current fraud problems are to help develop products and services to help our members address the problems that they're experiencing. But I have worked in the comms area, intelligence area, working with law enforcement, and in the data analytics area as well.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. And I'm sure we'll have interesting conversations later to see what your opinions are on this topic. And can I now go over to Richard? Richard, please introduce yourself.
Hi, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Hyde. I'm a senior researcher at the Social Market Foundation, Westminster-based think tank, and we've been doing some work on fraud and policing in recent months, which is where it sort of has led to sort of being invited to talk here. But prior to the Social Market Foundation, I actually spent 5.5 years working on business crime issues, among others, including a lot on cybercrime, fraud, and so on. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Interesting areas there to discuss further. And now I'll go to our last speaker, Ryan. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi there, my name's Ryan McLinkie Becker, and I'm currently Head of Economic Crime Policy and Engagement at HM Revenue and Customs, where I've been for the last 6 years. I've held a variety of roles in HM Revenue and Customs, primarily in the Fraud Investigation Service, including as Chief of Staff, Now, HMRC is the UK's tax and customs authority, so we are of course responsible for ensuring people pay their taxes and dishing out financial support. However, we are also a law enforcement agency and investigate serious tax fraud, holding people to account for businesses that cheat the system and commit tax crime. And we're also money laundering supervisor under the anti-money laundering regulations.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and we'll come back to you later and discuss those matters further. Well, without further ado, we'll invite our panellists to make their opening statements. That's 3 minutes or so when they get to say whatever they want on this topic. And can I just please remind you again, don't forget to ask a question, get them in as early as possible, and I'll endeavour to get answered as many as possible. So please use the question answer button at the bottom of your screen. Right, if we can now go over to you, Sandra, for your opening statement. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to address the part of the question, which is why we've got such high levels of fraud and financial crime in the UK, and looking at that predominantly from a consumer perspective. So the Crime Survey of England and Wales revealed 5.1 million fraud offences to the year ending September 2021, which is a 36% increase compared with the year ending 2019. So why is that number so high? So firstly, we have created an environment where carrying out fraud and financial crime could be done far more anonymously than it could before. The digitisation of the economy has brought a lot of benefit to millions of people in terms of ease of access to products and services, speed, accessibility, those kind of benefits. But those same benefits also apply to those perpetrating fraud and financial crime. So this has allowed for the industrialisation of fraud and financial crime. The perpetrators are able to act at speed, at high volume. They're able to mask their true identities by using the identities of others, synthetic identities. They are able to mask where they are with various other forms of technology. And they're also able to get other people to do their dirty work for them. We live in a time when fraud as a service can be purchased on the internet. Kits don't require a high level of technical expertise to use them, and it allows fraudsters to cast their net very wide indeed. I remember 20 years ago, around that time, when I was just starting out in fraud prevention, being shown around NSIS, as was now the NCA, and being shown huge filing cabinets which were full of mailbags. Those mailbags were stuffed with intercepted letters to people in the UK trying to scam them out of their life savings. And I remember looking at these massive mailbags and thinking, that is an awful lot of fraud attempts. But obviously now we'd be looking at that and thinking that is the equivalent of a couple of grains of sand on the beach compared to the volumes that are now being experienced these days. Because fraudsters can email, text, WhatsApp, we can use fraudulent adverts on social media. The list of methods that the fraudsters now have access to get in contact with their victim is massive. The list goes on. And when it comes to getting others to do their dirty work for them, fraud in the UK does still have a perception problem. Many people, normal people, don't see fraud as unacceptable. CIFAS carried out a survey with Opinion Matters not too long ago, actually, end of last year, which was testing people's attitudes to fraud. 1 in 13 people admitted to having carried out some form of first-party fraud, and almost 17% of people thought that being a money mule was an acceptable thing to do. Clearly, people have not stopped to think about what they're actually doing, that the money that they're moving through their bank account, which they clearly see as pretty innocuous, could have been, again, someone's life savings that they've been scammed out of, or that it could be going towards terrorist financing, or that it could have come through MSHT. Criminals can turn to mules as there is a ready supply of people willing to do that. They're easily accessible through things like recruitment on social media, and it puts that greater distance between themselves and their activities and the paths of that money. And there is actually another reason that I want to just bring into people's consideration around why our fraud figures are so high. And I think that's because people are actually now reporting fraud more. More of it is happening, but the reporting of it is generally increasing. There has previously been a stigma about being a victim of fraud, be that an individual or in fact an organisation. And it's a crime type where there's a fair amount of victim blaming. Why did you fall for that? Were you being greedy? Why didn't you see that and stop it? What was wrong with your controls? But I think there is now far greater acceptance that actually anyone can be a victim of fraud. And for individuals, there's a more of an incentive to report fraud, because actually if they're reporting it to their bank, if they've been a victim of some form of APP fraud in particular, they might now get their money back. So people are actually now being far more willing, I think, to report to their banks, to action fraud. And again, that is another one of those reasons why we were seeing an increase in fraud levels in the UK.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sandra. Lots to unpick there later. Can I just remind you, any questions, please send them through and we'll do our best to get them answered. And now I will pass over to Richard. Richard, if we could have your opening statement, please.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and give a very quick answer to the three questions that were sort of raised with us when we were asked to speak, which is, why is it so high? Which hopefully complements some of what Sandra has just said. What are the gaps in the approach we're currently taking at the moment? And what factors might enable us to have a better response to fraud? And I suppose you should say the work we've done has been mostly on the side of the sort of the policing, the law enforcement response. So that's sort of the angle I would take. So just to build, I think, on what Sandra's just said there, I think another reason why the fraud is so prevalent and sort of associated crimes such as cybercrime is because the police really don't have a handle on it. And you don't have to take my word for it. HMIC's report from 2019 was pretty damning about the police's terrible response to fraud, and the recent Barber review, strategic review into policing, estimated that about 0.1% of frauds end in some kind of charge or summons. So that gives you a sense of how well the police are doing with fraud. So it's basically a consequenceless crime. And to add insult to injury, there's some estimates that suggest that actually convictions for those that do get caught have fallen by 2/3 over the last decade as well. So even if you're unlucky enough to get caught, the likelihood of being convicted has fallen significantly as well. So there's not much risk to committing fraud. In terms of what are the gaps at the moment, I mean, so our perspective at SMF was that one of the problems was fraud is perhaps thought about too much in a silo and not how it interconnects with other crimes, whether that's cybercrime. Obviously most frauds are committed through digital means, whether it's organized crimes, a lot of fraud is committed by organized crime gangs in various ways, and also how it's connected to things like money laundering and so on, when criminals launder their proceeds of crime through legitimate banking systems or legitimate businesses and so on. So actually, we argued that you really shouldn't see fraud in isolation, but actually one among a number of interconnected crime types that actually together they should be the focus of policing, not fraud per se. And that sort of led us to think that actually what's needed here is what we call the systems approach. It might not be the right label for it, but essentially there's a whole host of domains that really need action from policymakers, from the private sector, from individuals, from the public sector, each of which attacks fraud on multiple fronts, and then together, sort of the sum of the parts is greater than what each individual bit can actually achieve. And then finally, we talked about how probably policing and the law enforcement response more generally needs to slightly change tack when you've got such an enormous criminal enterprise as fraud, and how it's connected as it is to organized crime, to cybercrime and so on, which is that we probably need to make policing a bit more mission orientated, which it's traditionally not been in this country. And in terms of how we might bring those about, I obviously won't give you a full list across 10 domains, but some of the things that we think need to be, some of the foundations that need to be put in place include getting a clearer picture of fraud, of how it fits in with organised crime, with cybercrime, with money laundering and so on, and getting a getting more accurate picture of its harms, who's committing it, all the motivations, incentives of all those who are committing, how they organise their criminal activities, and so on. It needs leadership from the top, and that means right at the most senior levels of government. If the Prime Minister, if the Chancellor, if the Home Secretary are not 100% behind something and pushing it, stuff doesn't get done in government, and that needs to be in place here. And then sort of one step below that, we think you need a good governance structure for this sort of mission orientated policing, for this systems approach that we talked about, to drive things forward and to monitor performance against in terms of reducing some of the crime that we talked about, and to delivering the outcomes we want. And then finally, the other thing, the hardy perennial of resourcing, which was ever thus, but we think that the police are overstretched now, as Michael Barber pointed out in his strategic review recently, and in order to put more resources into tackling economic crime more proportionately to its to its frequency and its prevalence in society, you're going to need to not just redistribute policing resources, but actually add significantly to them. So I'll stop there. And
okay, thank you very much, Richard, and very interesting talking about a systems approach, and certainly something we were talking about before the webinar in terms of more organisations working together, and we were talking about the key issue of data sharing and laws around that. So I'm sure those are topics we'll be coming back to later as well. Okay, I'm getting a few questions through, but I'll try and ask as many as I can, so please send in more if you want to. Right, I'm now going to hand over to Ryan. Ryan, can we have your opening statement, please?
Yes, of course. So firstly, a chance to define my terms, because economic crime is a really broad tent ranging from doorstep fraudsters to international bribery and corruption. So when I'm talking about economic crime in the next 3 minutes, I'm talking broadly about tax crime and tax fraud and money laundering as an associated offence, just as you would expect from someone coming from HMRC. Now, I sought to answer the question, does the professional thief and organised crime have a safe haven in economic crime? And I would like to say, unsurprisingly, given the cause I and my thousands of colleagues have committed their careers to in the Fraud Investigation Service, I would say not entirely no. And within HMRC, we have a strong track record of performance to back this up. So over the past 5 years, we've initiated 100,000 civil cases and more than 4,300 criminal investigations, securing and protecting more than £28 billion for the UK public services and securing 3,800 more than criminal convictions. This includes during the same period, recovering £1 billion of criminal assets, and that's literally taking that money out of criminal pockets and putting it back into the exchequer. And additionally, we've been able to make use of new tools and powers. So, for example, the account freezing orders. Last year alone, we issued 229 of those and secured more than £34 million as a result. And this is not only a story of strong performance, but a story of improving performance. We are recovering double the amount of assets under the Proceeds of Crime Act now as we were 5 years ago. And we've increased the number of supervisory interventions that we do as a supervisor from 1,400 in 2018-19 to over 3,700 in the last financial year. However, and this is a fairly large however, it would be misleading and naive for me not to put our success in the context of the scale of the problem as a whole. So although we have protected £28 billion over the past 5 years, the estimate is that the UK is losing £9 to £10 billion per year to tax crime. And although UK law enforcement has recovered billions of pounds of criminal assets, the total possible scale of money laundering in the UK is estimated to be in the hundreds of billions of pounds per year. So now, looking across all crime types, it's not unusual for not all of it to get detected. We've referenced crime survey figures, and I think in 2021, only 7% of all reported crimes resulted in a charge or summons. But there are particular factors that make economic crime particularly challenging to bring to justice. So some of these challenges are conceptual, such as money laundering by its very definition being intrinsically bound up with concepts of deceit, obfuscation and opaqueness. The diffuse nature of victimhood. For example, whilst there are victims of tax fraud and it does cause real harm, that victim is sometimes at the level of society itself, rather than an individual who is able to identify and report it. In addition to these conceptual challenges, there are practical challenges, the complexity of our global economic and legal systems, the fact that these crimes easily cross borders, leaving law enforcement wading through the red tape of international collaboration, and the fact that the specialist skills needed to interrogate and hold our financial systems to account are exactly the same skills, whereas there are much greater pay incentive to be involved in upholding it. So I guess I would leave you with the idea that economic crime is not an entirely safe haven due to the committed efforts to shine a light on the phenomenon. However, we are still hunting for something in the dark. We may now have bigger and brighter torches, and indeed across law enforcement we are increasingly collaborating and combining our torches in order to fan out as a more efficient search party. However, actually turning on the light might require a more fundamental change than just better and brighter torches. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan, and all of the panel for your interesting comments. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so I'll move straight over to those and get into a general discussion with the panel. The first question I've got is, and I'm going to ask this of Richard, because it was Richard that said it. It's from Mike Levy, and he said, so if fraud is so consequenceless, why is the rate not much higher, and why don't a lot more people commit it?
I'm not sure I said it was consequenceless. I think it's a very it's a crime with lots of consequences, financial, personal, social, and so on. So I mean, I wouldn't agree with that premise, if you like.
What we're saying is why haven't we got even more people committing it? If we some of the things that you and certainly Sandra have outlined.
I see what you mean. Yeah. Right, but that's that's what
people committing it.
Sorry, that's a conundrum about crime more generally, right? There's been a question in sociology for decades about, or longer, why most people don't commit crime, given actually the police relative to a population. If more people turn to crime, it would be much harder for them to get caught and so on. So there's a bigger sociological question there, I think, which I don't know if it's ever been answered. I mean, there's certainly plausible thoughts as to why that might be, but I mean, I would say it seems like there's quite a lot of fraud going on, and we're probably not counting it all. So, for example, the Crime Survey of England and Wales doesn't count the frauds committed against businesses, which harks back to a previous life of mine, which a constant problem was the fact that businesses were left out a lot of these discussions and were quite significant victims on quite a significant level to a lot of types of crime, and particularly cyber and fraud. So I don't agree. I hope I didn't suggest it was consequenceless. For individuals and society. If it's consequenceless for the criminals, I think yes, that's broadly true. I think the data suggests that, but I think that there's a and that fits with a broader sociological question about why a lot of people don't commit crime, I guess. But yeah, finally, I think I think there's a lot that we aren't counting, for example. So, you know, there's probably more of it out there than we know.
Okay, thank you, Richard. If I can just come to you, Sandra, and sort of perhaps slightly rephrase the question and say, what do you think that actually sort of tips individual staff to commit crime when they possibly have been there a long time? I don't know, my experiences, I found that people sort of go into an organisation perhaps with the intention of committing a crime or spot an opportunity quite early on, or they've been there a long time. There doesn't seem to be this middle ground. And I'm quite intrigued with people that have been there a long time. What could suddenly tip them to that?
I think if you take an example of, like, if someone finds a wallet in the street and it's full of someone's driving license, credit cards and 100 quid, for example, there will be people that will say, I will take 20 quid and hand the rest into the police station, 50 quid, hand the rest in, through to pocketing all of the cash, maybe handing the wallet in, and those that will just take everything in the wallet and not hand the wallet in. There is a range of people's perception of what is acceptable when they are presented with an opportunity. But I think there is a key thing there is presented with an opportunity. Obviously, the longer someone's been in an organisation, the far better they understand what that opportunity could potentially look like. But then I think what someone might do with our metaphorical wallet in the street also depends on what situation they happen to be in that point in time. And I think the drivers of people, particularly to commit internal fraud, if they are a long-standing employee, probably start from, or in a lot of cases, I think start from knowing an opportunity exists, there is a system weakness, they have access to something that they can create a benefit from, and then having something that is pushing them to take advantage of that weakness that they know exists. And that could be, often people put addiction down as a driver, at least to start with, for people to commit internal fraud. And then on the back of that, if people get away with it the first time, they might try it again and again. And it might then be that something that might have started from, maybe a paying to cover an addiction. People with gambling issues are often cited as being internal fraudsters. But if you have got an immediate requirement at a point in time, which you then satisfy with having committed fraud the first, second, maybe third time, but you've been successful and you've got away with it, and your moral compass has become accustomed to the fact that you have committed that fraud and you've justified it to yourself to start with, then it's an easier step for people to take to continue that on, to move from a fraud for need for more of a fraud for greed. But I think, you do have people who are placed in organisations, often in some instances placed by organised crime groups to do a particular job, be that facilitate internal fraud, release personal data, whatever it might be. You will have the members of staff who possibly don't have too much in the way of loyalty to the organisation, if they've only been in there a month, a couple of months, who are then recruited because of the position that they're in. And you will have those whose motivations are different, but are, the opportunity is something that they can see based on their experience in the role. What is slightly worrying now is you have got people who are in positions where they can facilitate fraud in some way for an external party, who are now advertising their services more proactively through various forums. People who are in positions where they can facilitate applications, who can wave through particular things that a external party might want to happen, and are actively selling those services. It's there is a range of motivations, but for the more long-standing employee, I think it leans more towards starting from a need perspective and then moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. I agree with you with that. There's a tipping point later on, and that might be personal circumstances, or it might be something to do between the individual and the organisation that sort of tips them. If they, for example, get looked over for promotion or something like that, it might be something in 20 years you would never have considered. You've known of those weaknesses for a long time, but you've never pursued them. I'll just go back to the next question I've got then, and I would like to ask Ryan this, please. We've read a question that asks about the levels of fraud during the pandemic, really in terms of COVID restrictions, the HMRC bounce back loans, frauds, that kind of thing. What do you think? Obviously, this is a very political area, but really, what do you think in terms of what's the consequences for offenders on this area?
Yeah, thank you. So I can't get into all of the politics of it, as you can understand, but I would say at the time when those schemes were being designed, we were at a moment of sort of national crisis, and there was a calculation taken between the necessity of getting support out to those who needed it the most versus the risks that would be managed that some support might get to those who were playing the system. But in the Fraud Investigation Service, we were involved in the design of the schemes from the start, including the COVID support schemes and job retention schemes, and we were designing in controls and risk assessments in place. So as much as there were sums of money that did go out under those two schemes, there were also sums of money that we were successfully able to prevent going out to the wrong hands in the first place. Since that balance between some money needing to get out the door quickly did mean that some ended up in the wrong hands, and we do have criminal investigations underway into those that took advantage of the scheme, shall we say, and there have been arrests that have occurred against people that have exploited those schemes. In addition, we've used account freezing order powers, including our largest ever freezing order in the past year, which was actually, we successfully forfeited, I think it was £36 million in one go from somebody who had taken money out of a COVID fraud. So yes, there was a broader political piece in play around decision making at the time, and we are absolutely doing our bit now to investigate and recover any proceeds that did get out of the door as best as we can.
Thank you. Right, and say once again a very difficult area, because as we know, economic crime fraudsters are, very quick to adapt, and they will certainly capitalise and seize on any opportunity. Will that be COVID? Would that be Ukrainian war, etc.? We've seen all these things happening, and I'm sure they will continue to. I think it only sort of says that we've got to move faster in getting our act together, as sort of Richard was talking about earlier, in terms of a whole body systems approach. Okay, I've got another question to ask then. One of the areas that you and Grant's asked about is, do we need to subdivide fraud, because there's so many different types, they will require so many different methods of prevention, and maybe only some can be prevented, but not realistically prosecuted. Can I come to you first on that, Richard, and then I'll come to you, Sandra?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think in one sense, yes, absolutely. There are many different kinds of fraud, which are different, fundamentally the same in their nature, that they're frauds, but different in their details, if you like, which will require different, slightly different responses from the focus that we've taken in what we've done, different responses from law enforcement, although we think a lot of the law enforcement, one of the problems with the law enforcement landscape at the moment is it's too distributed across too many different levels and so on, and needs consolidating a bit more. So you do bring more of the expertise together, and you can get more cross-fertilization of expertise and so on through the police, and particularly so when their counter fraud resources are so limited at the moment. There's probably extra benefits at the moment from bringing them together. But yeah, I think in principle, conceptually, that's right. There are obviously different types of frauds that will require different responses. I'd be at this stage, given I think we'd argue SMF, we've not really given fraud a proper go in terms of a proper law enforcement response proportionate to the scale of the problem, that we'd want to say any frauds are beyond investigation. But yeah, I mean, who knows, that might turn out to be just the reality. But I think at this stage that would be too early to say.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Sandra, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think in answer to the question, do we kind of need to subdivide fraud? The answer is yes and no. From a language perspective, fraud is far too broad. Economic crime, financial crime, fraud will mean very different things to different people. And that makes it really difficult when trying to communicate some of the messages around fraud, financial crime, economic crime, particularly in messaging to consumers and that sort of area. It's the way that people working in fraud and financial crime prevention talk about fraud doesn't make it easy for people outside of that space to understand what we're talking about, without having to then explain in more detail what we're talking about, which could be using the same term to describe something different. So there's a confusion there, and if we can actually use better language to talk about fraud, then I think particularly from an education and messaging perspective, we would do better. But it's not an easy thing to do. But in terms of a response to fraud, one of the things that CIFAS has shown over the last 30 years through its data sharing schemes is that the same people perpetrating fraud will perpetrate different types of fraud across different sectors and across different types of methodology. So whilst it's nice to be able to categorize the types of fraud you're talking about in order to get a much better handle on the solutions that are required, you cannot handle them from a response perspective in a silo. So yes, we need to understand where the greatest harm is being done, which means we need to count things consistently and accurately at a level that is appropriate to be able to form a response to that. But the response itself, particularly when it comes to information sharing across public, private, different types of fraud typology, that needs to be looked at in the round. Otherwise, we do risk not seeing the full picture of the harm that a individual OCG, whatever it might be, is actually perpetrating.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, the last round of questions before we look to wrap up is, well, what should we do about this? I think one area I'd like to explore is we talk about being harder on fraudsters. So really, where is it? What can we do to deter fraudsters? Is prison the right answer? Is, sanctions, getting the money back? Where does it hit the hardest to fraudsters? I'm going to ask each of you in turn here, and we'll use it as a sort of summing up. So Ryan, I'm going to come to you first, and then I'll come to you, Richard, then Sandra.
Okay, so I think there was a good point in the question earlier about what frauds do you seek to prevent and what frauds do you seek to respond to. And we definitely take a sort of promote, prevent, respond approach in HMRC. So there are certain fraud types and certain actors who you might be able to prevent getting involved in fraud in the first place through effective communications, through education. So I think, for example, we do a lot of outreach work with our supervised businesses to educate them on their compliance obligations under the anti-money laundering regulations. We do a lot of teaching webinars to prevent them getting wrapped up in terrorist financing or money laundering in the first place. Similar approaches could be taken with certain types of actors within the wider fraud and money laundering space. I'm thinking of, for example, the sort of cash couriers, money mules, those people who are on the periphery and sort of getting involved almost thoughtlessly in a crime without sort of realizing the consequences. There might be some opportunities to dissuade those sorts of people from getting involved in the first place, and possibly similarly or more powerfully if you're looking at your professional enablers for whom their reputation and things is such of a premium. If you give a prison sentence to someone who is a lawyer or an accountant, that prison sentence hits them harder than it would do an OCG for whom prison is sort of a risk of the job, as it were. So there's sort of different players who might be affected by different messaging. But I really think a lot of the focus and attention needs to be in the prevention space, because that's cutting out those loopholes, those opportunities, improving the system as a whole. When you're getting into the response phase, you've already sort of failed and you're sort of playing catch up. In that area, I think asset recovery is an undervalued tool. So we look at prosecution figures, we look at conviction rates, and these are important. But taking a case all the way through to trial is long, it's painful. There are quite a lot of effective civil approaches now to recovering assets and taking out the financial incentive of financial crime. And given that so much of what we're talking about is money motivated, if we can hit people in their pockets, then that's really effective. So I think ultimately it depends on the person, their sort of individual motivation. It depends on the crime type. So I think there's an argument for that previous question. Yes, the sort of subdivide fraud and economic crime, both in terms of the types, but also in what you're trying to achieve, whether it's prevention, whether it's asset recovery, and whether it's sort of threat and opportunity reduction overall. So yes, it depends, but there is more we can do. And I think it's taking it on all fronts at once would be no bad thing.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. And Richard, can I just come to you for so quick summing up of what you think we should be doing next?
Sure. So, I mean, I think I said at the beginning, we've argued that there needs to be sort of a systems-based approach, sort of based in a mission-based law enforcement kind of way forward. So, which I think traditionally we've not really seen in this country. So, you know, a real sort of rather than a reactive policing, actually a much more something the NCA was sort of set up to in part do, but it's a relatively small actor in this in this space. And part of what we want to see is sorting out. I noticed one of the questioners has mentioned the sort of the diversity of the counter fraud landscape in this country, and I think there's no other word for it other than a mess. And I think actually sorting that out would actually be a good first step towards putting the response on a more robust and effective footing. And then, and as I said, the systems approach, I think, and I won't list all the different domains that we think the systems approach needs to act on, but very much in line with what Rian just said. You know, there are a wide range of fronts where changes can be made, we think, where there can be reforms, bigger and smaller ones, which will overall have quite a significant sort of combined effect, sort of greater than the sum of the parts. So that's I think there's certainly, from our perspective, there's a lot that's not been tried in this space yet, and a lot of old ideas that have never been tried but have been around for a long time that we might think about reviving, and also some new ideas which, you know, before we give up on fraud are definitely worth trying, and trying properly. So that means giving them sufficiently human and financial resourcing and technological capability and all the things that you know, perhaps have lacked in the law enforcement response until now.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And Sandra, if I could just come to you very quickly in a minute or so, could you sort of sum up what you think needs doing?
Yeah, it's very helpful, and I get to say I agree with my two panel colleagues on this front. I think yes, it is about being able to have that system-wide approach, to have a more cohesive approach to identifying those doing the most harm and take the appropriate proportionate action against those people in the manner which will actually serve as the biggest deterrent for those individuals. So be that taking their money, potentially sending them to prison, whatever it might be. There, it is not a one-size-fits-all of what the appropriate response to the people involved in fraud actually is. But we need to be effective at being able to target the resources to identify those where we are going to have the greatest impact, and that does require a system-wide approach. And it does involve being targeted about the harms we're trying to counteract with this approach as well. From a purely policing perspective, I quite like the ideas of days of action, concerted effort to create a bang for a short period of time, to then create a more publicisable deterrent to people, particularly at a lower level, getting involved in some of the types of crime type where we can make some of the bigger players' lives much more difficult if we take away the people who are doing their dirty work for them. So I think there are a number of actions that can be taken, but it is dependent on the fraud types that we're tackling and the motivations of the people who are carrying them out.
Okay, thank you. Sorry if I didn't get to your question. I think we had a couple in that I didn't quite get to. As ever on these economic crime webinars, we never seem to have enough time. I'm sure there's enough topics there to pursue in future webinars, and I know we've got one coming up in the next few weeks on the cost of crime and what's the real cost to individuals and the government and society and organisations in the next few weeks, if you want to look out for that. A few notices just before we wrap up then. We've got the cyber OSPAs open at the moment. They're closing on the 25th of April. We've also got the Romanian OSPAs open, end of April for those. Also got the US and the Canadian OSPAs open. Probably more for the audience we've got today. I can just point out that the TECAs have now opened the last couple of weeks, and they will be closing at the 8th of August for those of you who are interested in tackling economic crime awards. And we will be having a physical event towards the end of the year, either the end of November or beginning of December. And of course, as always, we will be doing this all over again next week. Next week, we're talking about crime prevention through environmental design. Is it still fit for purpose? Certainly, since we've had the pandemic, what should this look like now in a more modern society? Just before we go then, I would like to thank the participants for taking place, for the speakers. Thank you very much for your contribution. Also for you, the audience, for your insightful questions and comments. And I'd like to say a special thank you today in particular for those of you who are regulars. You probably know Sarah Gray behind the scenes now. I've got to say that this is her last week, unfortunately, with us, and she's contributed immensely to the success of these webinars over the last year or so. Don't forget, there'll be a copy of this webinar on the website tomorrow alongside a blog. So I hope to see you again. And until then, as we always say, wherever you are in the world, stay safe.